Hello and welcome to the Macro Business Population Ponzi Primer. My name's Tim Fuller and I have with me here one of the lead bloggers on the Macro Business site, Leith Van Onselen. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, Tim. How are you?
Very well, very well. So what we're going to do today is over the next 10 minutes or so, just quickly get you up to speed on the population Ponzi theme that's quite strong throughout the Macro Business blog, with the idea being that you get a full picture of, I guess, some of the facts and figures and history behind the push, and also obviously where it's headed. So, Leith, I guess what's the deal, mate? What's going on? Why are we talking so much about this now?
Yeah, look, it basically gets down to the lived experience of what it's like to live in one of the major cities in Australia, like Sydney and Melbourne. We've got a situation where the population is growing extremely rapidly in the major cities, and this is leading to increased congestion on our roads and public transport, and it's having big impacts on housing affordability, meaning that you've either got to pay more for your home, or you can only live in, say, a high-rise apartment or way out in the fringe. It also has impacts on the job market. Obviously, with employers able to just reach out and grab a foreign worker whenever they want, there's less incentive to employ locals, which leads to lower working conditions and also lower wages growth. And of course, obviously, more people puts more strain on Australia's natural environment.
Okay, sure, but I guess sort of thinking back over the history of Australia since Federation, perhaps we've always been an immigrant country. Why is it so relevant now?
Yeah, look, we have always been an immigrant country, and that's great. But the fact of the matter is the population growth so far this century has been absolutely, massive and much bigger than Australia's historical experience. I'll put it to you this way: in the 116 years since Federation, Australia's immigration intake was about 70,000 per year. And in the last 12 years, it's roughly tripled to about 210,000 per year. Now, there's a chart there which you can all see, which breaks down all the numbers over the various time periods. But effectively, in the last 12 years or so, Australia's immigration intake's tripled, and this has led to a huge surge in Australia's population. And under the government's own forecast, this is predicted to continue until mid-century. So it's really just numbers game.
That is a pretty massive rise. And I guess then thinking more so against Australia versus the rest of the world, is this sort of just a problem that we see in Australia, or is it sort of something that's common elsewhere?
Yeah, look, Australia is the fastest growing medium to large nation in the world in terms of population growth. And since 2003, we've grown at about 2.5 times the OECD average. And we've also been the fastest in the Anglo countries. Now, it is true that New Zealand currently is growing faster than Australia, but if you take a decade-long view, Australia is easily the leader.
Sure, thanks, Leith. And so I guess pretty significant growth there. It seems like Australia's leading the pack with the sort of levels of immigration. But where exactly is all this growth coming from?
Yeah, look, again, it's certainly immigration's the driver. Now, there's another chart there which just shows the immigration intake against the overall population growth. And you can see that immigration is the de facto population policy for the nation. I mentioned before that we're in the 116 years since Federation, we averaged 70,000 net overseas migration a year. But since the last 12 years, we've tripled that. And look, if we reduce the immigration intake, it's obviously going to have a commensurate impact on overall population growth. Whereas if we increase it or maintain it at a higher level, population is going to grow a lot faster. It is the main driver.
Sure. So I guess the real question remains: what is driving the rate of immigration?
Yeah, look, the primary driver is the federal government's permanent migrant intake. Now it is true that immigration counts both permanent and temporary migrants who stay here for several number of years, but the reason why it's the permanent migrant intake that matters the most is because temporary migrants are by definition temporary. Even if they stay in Australia for even 5 years or so, they eventually leave. But whereas permanent migrants generally don't. Now, since the turn of the century, the federal government's increased the migrant intake by 150%. It was about 80,000 in 1999, and it's currently tracking at just over 200,000. So this is actually what is the long-term driver of the rise in immigration. It's also will be the long-term driver of Australia's population growth.
I guess obviously with the rates that have been predicted, do you want to just talk us through what would happen if we removed immigration versus the path we're on now?
Yeah, sure, Tim. This chart here is fantastic. Now, it comes from the Productivity Commission's Migrant Intake Australia report, which was released in late 2016. And it shows that if Australia cut all immigration today, or as of 2016, Australia's population would stabilise at about 27 million mid-century. So that's around 2.5 million more than the current level. Whereas under the current 200,000 strong immigration level intake, Australia's population will hit around 40 million plus mid-century. So that's a difference of around 13 million people caused purely by immigration. Now, it's not just people who obviously hop off the plane and arrive in Australia. It also comes down to the fact that that new migrants also have kids. So you have a sort of double impact on population growth. You have the direct impact from the migrants, and then also the secondary impacts from migrants having children.
Okay, yeah, sure. And look, I guess 44 million is a pretty significant number, and it's pretty hard to imagine the infrastructure that we've got today handling even the current sort of levels of population, let alone a bit under doubling.
Yeah, well, at the moment we're probably on track to more like 41 million if 200,000 is maintained. But the Productivity Commission does say in its report that if we had the last 10 years migrant rate of immigration, and that continued for the next, say, 40 years, we would actually get to closer to 50 million. But
wow.
But where we're tracking right now is around 40, 41.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Leith. And so ultimately, I guess where are we headed? What's Australia going to look like if we continue on these paths?
Yeah, look, one of the main problems with running a mass immigration policy in its current form is that most of the migrants are actually coming to Sydney and Melbourne. So we saw in the post-war period when we had a lot from sort of Eastern Europe and Western Europe as well. But those migrants tend to spread more evenly throughout Australia. However, what the latest census has shown, and the one before that, is that more than ever, migrants are flooding into Sydney and Melbourne. And these cities are already very crowded, and it's obviously creating a huge strain on both infrastructure as well as housing. Now, just to put it into perspective, Sydney's population's ballooned by nearly 850,000 over the past 12 years, whereas Melbourne's population's ballooned by nearly 1.1 million over the past 12 years. And in the last year alone, Melbourne's population rose by about 130,000, whereas Sydney's increased by around 100,000. So, it is running at very high levels. It is having obviously a big impact. And under the current projections from the federal government, this is expected to increase for the next 35 years till mid-century.
Wow. Okay. And as someone who lives in Western Melbourne, I can attest to the effects of having a lot of people move in a short period of time. Talking now, sort of focusing more on Sydney. Do you want to just talk through the projections here?
Yeah, look, this chart here comes from the New South Wales government, and it was released last year, and it shows that over the next 20 years, Sydney's population is projected to increase by just over 1.7 million. So that's about 87,000 people per year, 77,000 of which is expected to come from net overseas migration. So that's the equivalent of adding around 4.5 Canberras to Sydney's growth in just 20 years. Now, according to the state government's own projections, if net overseas migration was cut to zero, now I'm not saying we should do that, but just using the counterfactual, if it was cut to zero, Sydney's population would only increase by about 200,000 or 10,000 per year over the next 20 years. So, immigration is the main driver of Sydney's population growth, and obviously it's going to cause, it'll be the main driver of the rising congestion and continuing housing problems that Sydney's already got.
Okay, Lee, so that's Sydney covered, but what are your thoughts towards Melbourne?
Yeah, look, Melbourne's actually facing an even bigger population increase than Sydney. The state government's own population projections, which were released last year, projected that Melbourne's population would increase by about 3.4 million people in the 35 years to 2015. Now, that represents growth of nearly 100,000 people per year, and that's equivalent to adding, say, 9 Canberras or 2.5 Adelaides to Melbourne's population. Now, another way to look at this is that Melbourne took about 170 years to hit almost 3.4 million people in 2001, yet Melbourne is expected to hit the same number of people again in just 35 years. Now that just shows you the size of the task, and also how unrealistic it is.
Sure, Leith. So it's certainly something to think about. I guess, look, thinking outside of just purely population and obviously the demands that people have on our infrastructure and on our services, which is one of the reasons why people want to move here anyway, isn't it? Because of the high standard of living. Do you want to just talk us through in some figures, what's going to be required to keep this population on track and our lifestyles to being preserved, essentially?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I guess where the rubber hits the road on this is that, again, the federal government's own projections show that Australia is going to add about 400,000 people per year until mid-century. Now, that's the equivalent to adding a Canberra to Australia's population each and every year, again, mostly to Sydney and Melbourne. And this obviously requires a hell of a lot of infrastructure and services to keep up. Now, the Australia Institute's created this fantastic graphic, which just shows you the size of the task. And according to the Australia Institute, we'll need 61 primary schools, 2 public hospitals, and 25 residential aged care facilities, along with a whole lot of housing each and every year, just to keep up with the population growth, let alone all the roads, trains, and all the other types of economic and social infrastructure.
Wow, yeah, that's it's a mammoth task to maintain to keep our lifestyle the way that we know it. And I guess, look, obviously, a lot of what we've spoken about here, whilst it's a problem now, things can be done. So do you want to just talk us through what we can do and what we can push for and who we can vote for, perhaps to do something about this?
Yeah, look, I think Australia first and foremost needs a population plan. We don't have one at the moment. We're basically just growing for growth's sake. There is no plan about how big we want Australia to become, or how all this infrastructure is going to be provided, or where it's all going to go. We're basically flying blind. And, it's my strong view that Australia needs to slow its population growth. We should aim for a population target of around 30 million by 2060 versus 40 plus million under current settings. And all this requires is basically paring Australia's immigration intake back to the historical average, the 116-year average of about 70,000 people per year. Rather than 200,000 plus as we've got currently. Now, if viewers want to get involved and want to obviously try and make a difference on this, there are a few things they can do. First and foremost, you can take the political action. There is a very sensible political party out there. It's a new party called Sustainable Australia, which has a very sensible policy platform across a whole range of issues, but especially on this population issue. You can also write to your ministers, both federal and state, and basically demand that they address the issue. Apart from that, you can also obviously tell as many people as you can about the issue, educate them, leave comments in mainstream media sites, etc. The key thing is Australia needs a rational national debate and strategy on population policy. We just don't have one. And my ultimate hope is that Australia has a plebiscite on Australia's future population size. Actually ask the Australian people about how big they want Australia to become, and give us a say. That's all we need.
Fantastic. Thanks, Leith. So look, with that, hopefully you've got something out of today in regards to population Ponzi. If you need to know more, of course, feel free to check out the remainder of the Primer videos and featured articles that we've got in our Primer section. And ultimately, I guess if what the themes do mean something to yourself, then do have a think about subscribing to the Macro Business blog. Obviously, it supports the guys creating the content they put out every day and the research that they do, but of course also supporting the fight against the population Ponzi. So thanks for your time, and we'll see you at the next one.